I'm sure pretty much everyone who uses the internet has encountered a catfish in some form. For most of us, it's usually not more serious than some guy on RuneScape who pretended to be your girlfriend to get free stuff. But of course, there's always some people who take it much further and have more nefarious reasons for pretending to be someone else. In today's video, we're talking about a 14-year-old boy referred to as John who catfished as multiple detailed online personas to deceive his 16-year-old friend into murdering him. Let's begin with a bit of backstory. As you might already be thinking, John was a troubled child, and this began early in his life. When he was 4 years old, he found out that the man he thought was his father was actually his stepfather. John had no memories of his biological father, but his mother stated that the father was abusive, both sexually and physically, and had kidnapped John when he was a baby. John remembers his stepfather as being bad on drugs. A few years later, his stepfather left their family. This forced John, his mother, and his sister to relocate to a smaller house in Manchester. He often heard his mother crying alone in her room. At 7 years old, John was dealing with his emotions by trying to injure himself scraping a toothpick against his inner wrist. Elementary school was no relief from his home life. He was smart and got good grades, but he was teased mercilessly by the other kids, who taunted him with racial slurs or called him gay because he mostly befriended girls. He didn't tell anyone about the insults and harassment, and bottled up his emotions. However, the bullying took a severe toll on him, and years later he said that he always felt as if people who walked past would start calling him a terrorist when he was out of earshot. When John was around 11 years old, his mother met another man who moved in with the family shortly after. John was jealous and felt as if he no longer got any attention. He felt like he didn't belong anywhere, except for when he went online. John was given his first laptop when he was 13 years old, and soon the internet became his best friend. He started spending hours online every night after school in chat rooms intended to bring together teenagers living in Manchester. But John wasn't going by his real name. He thought that no one would want to talk to his real self, so he became Rachel West, a beautiful and charming teenage girl. By February of 2003, John was chatting with about 20 to 30 people every day through online messengers. This is when he found 16-year-old Mark, who played sports, had a thriving social life, and did passably well in school. There was an immediate spark. John was entranced by Mark, while Mark fell for Rachel, the girl he thought he was talking to. Shortly afterwards, John decided to introduce his real self into the chat room as Rachel's brother. Mark and John had a lot in common and they clicked well with each other. They'd often video call each other using their webcams. A few months later, in April, Mark admitted that he thought he was falling in love with Rachel. Even though he'd only spoken with her online and had only seen the photo of her she used for an avatar, he considered her his girlfriend and tried over and over again to arrange a meetup with her in person. This obviously alarmed John, seeing as Rachel was purely fiction, and he decided that he needed to come up with something to stall and deter Mark. Instead of using excuses like being busy with school or having strict parents, John decided that he would take more drastic measures. This is where we introduce his new character, Kevin. Kevin was revealed as a crazed homosexual stalker who was obsessed with abducting and sexually assaulting Rachel and John. His messages in the chat room stood out because he would only use pink text, because he was gay. The character of Kevin began demanding that Mark perform sexual actions on camera to prevent any harm coming to the siblings. Some of the chat logs from this time read, "Wank, you wanking on camera for them?
What else can I do?
Oh my god, why is he making you wank?
'Cause he is gay.
You don't have to do anything for me.
I do, Rach. I love you.
I love you too." Despite Mark keeping up his end of the bargain, Kevin abducted Rachel regardless. He and his fictional accomplices then sexually assaulted and tortured her before brutally murdering her. Mark was devastated by this, and he was further traumatized by the message Kevin sent after killing Rachel, which said,
"Kicked all her stomach, put her head under water, then out, freezing cold. And she stained my sheets when she was bleeding. You weren't there for her, however much she screamed for you."
As his online life began eating away at him, Mark's real life unraveled and his grades in school got worse and worse. John's manipulation had worked as planned, leaving a distressed Mark truly believing that his girlfriend had been murdered. John saw Mark's depression as a window of opportunity to get closer to him by chatting as himself. I'm sure that this story already sounds completely unbelievable to many of us today, especially because it has so many of the red flags commonly seen in the show Catfish. John himself was surprised that Mark believed it at all because a lot of things he said didn't make any sense. John later admitted to feeling some guilt over his manipulation, and he even had a minor character say,
"Well, dang it, man, if I told you I pretended to be Rachel one night."
to Mark shortly after Rachel's death. While Mark was distraught thinking that his love had passed away, John's interest in Mark only grew. He later said that he really looked up to Mark and that he created this fictional universe and the tangled web of characters because he wanted him for himself. But he still didn't feel comfortable confessing to Mark or giving up on using a persona. With Rachel out of the picture, John felt like he had to create another identity to continue holding on to Mark's interest. This is when another character of John's was introduced in the chat room. Her name was Lindsay East, a suspiciously similar name to her predecessor character, Rachel West. Unfortunately, Mark didn't catch on to this resemblance. Lindsay's time in the chat room was brief. She lasted less than a month before she too had to be killed off when Mark began showing signs that he was romantically interested in her as well. On April 27th of that year, Lindsay was apparently attacked and killed by members of the British government. After her death, Mark received an email from her saying that she was killed because she tried to protect him and John. At this point, John decided to bring Rachel back to life. Her story now got even more convoluted than before. She explained to Mark that she never died but had been in a coma due to her injuries, and then went on to say that she had gotten pregnant and gave birth to Mark's baby. This is obviously completely unbelievable. For one, Rachel's injuries as described by Kevin would have made carrying a pregnancy to term highly unlikely as he repeatedly kicked her in the stomach. But more importantly, Rachel and Mark had never even met each other, which obviously makes this pregnancy impossible. However, Mark never expressed disbelief or distrusted any of the characters involved. John admitted to feeling conflicted at this point, saying that he both loved and felt trapped by the complex story that he'd created. He grew increasingly isolated from his real life. He felt like he had no one to talk to about his imaginary world, especially not Mark, who John realized would definitely stop talking to him once he found out about John's intense crush on him and all the deception that came with it. Around this time, the two boys went from communicating solely online to meeting up in person. This is when John began to see that Mark was well liked by girls and that many seemed interested in him, which upset him. He said that this is when he first felt as if he wanted to die. He explained to a therapist later that he thought if he could just die, then things wouldn't get any worse. John became so obsessed with being online at this time that he spent all his time on the computer, crafting his tale from 4 in the afternoon to 7 in the morning every day. He lost his appetite and said that from March onwards he lost a tremendous amount of weight because he simply stopped eating. He was absolutely consumed with his fictitious world. The Rachel saga ended just as quickly as it began, and our next character swiftly entered the chat room. John called her Janet Dobbinson, who described herself as a 44-year-old woman who was still very sexy. She had a more complex backstory than previous characters. She was a Secret Service agent and a mother, and she often spoke about how she was trapped in a marriage with an awful man that she longed to escape from. Janet also tended to write in all capital letters. Janet was the first character that Mark seemed to express some doubt about, as he found it hard to believe that she was actually a spy working for the British government. He was eventually convinced of the validity of her claims by her inside knowledge of his daily life and activities, such as when he got his hair cut. According to Janet, Mark was actually living in a neighborhood that, unbeknownst to him or his family, was full of spies. She convinced him that his teachers, his bus drivers, and the nearby shopkeepers were all actually undercover intelligence agents, and that one day maybe he could join them. Janet had a series of tasks for Mark that would prove whether or not he was cut out to become a secret agent with her. He was placed under surveillance to ensure that he followed instructions.
4 agents watching you now.
Janet told Mark that she needed him to be the bodyguard of a boy named James Bell, who was of the utmost importance to the British government. If he could sufficiently fill this role, he would be rewarded with £30,000. Mark was so excited by the thought of this that he felt like all his birthdays had come at once. Around this time, John skipped school for the first time. As it turns out, this was due to a demand made by Janet Dobbinson. She revealed to Mark that James Bell was a codename for John and that he was worth £568 billion. To be precise, that's how much money the gems sitting in a giant safe at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean were worth, and John was the only person in the world who could access these jewels because no one else could enter the combination to the safe. It only existed in his head.
Only he can walk through the door. It will not allow anyone else.
Not even Queen?
No.
This is why she'd instructed Mark to protect him. She said that to keep him safe, Mark needed to go to John's school and tell his teachers that he had an appointment so that he could skip his classes. He did as he was told, and the two boys went to Mark's house to spend the day. John's mother, knowing that he'd never skipped his classes before, was very worried. She found out that he'd been at his new friend Mark's house. This was the first time she'd heard of Mark because John had become increasingly secretive and to himself as his fictional universe progressed, and he spent almost all of his time in his room alone. Soon after this, his mother decided to check his laptop to see what he was doing online. When she opened it, she was greeted by Mark's frequent messages in the chat room, which wasn't alarming. What did bother her, however, were the messages from Janet Dobbinson. Janet was portrayed as being a high-ranking agent within the British Secret Service, so high-ranking that she was even involved with the affairs of the royal family. One message read,
I got the Queen out of bed.
In response, Mark said,
No offense, but what does she do anyway?
Janet never answered that question, instead replying by saying,
This is the UK's biggest secret. I can trust you. Would it be possible to look at you while I tell you?
Janet then made requests for Mark to perform sexual activities for her on video chat. John's mother was horrified, as many parents would be upon seeing messages of a 44-year-old woman ordering a minor to do explicit acts. She immediately removed the modem from the laptop and hid his computer in her room. This ultimately proved to be fruitless, as John quickly learned of the hiding spot and he would sneakily assemble the computer to chat online at night and then reassemble it before his mother noticed it was missing. His mother also demanded that she meet Mark and his parents, and she and John took a trip to their nearby home. Shortly afterwards, John invited Mark to his house for a sleepover. If you asked his mother what the two boys did, she would have told you that they just watched videos all night. What she didn't know was that these videos were of an adult nature, and the boys engaged in some sexual activity that night. It turns out that these activities were actually another task from Janet. She said that it was crucial that the two boys partook in oral sex so that John would appear to be gay. Janet explained to Mark that the orders came from the current Prime Minister Tony Blair, and she was unable to explain why they were necessary for security reasons. But if Mark refused to complete this task, she would be fired immediately. He denied this task several times despite Janet saying that he would be rewarded handsomely if he completed it. But eventually she convinced him by saying that she would lose her job and maybe even be in danger if he didn't complete the task. Moving forward, both sets of parents didn't really approve much of the friendship, and they mutually agreed that they would no longer allow the boys to have sleepovers. Furthermore, both John and Mark were given a strict warning by their mothers to never speak with Janet Dobbinson again. Of course, John continued to pretend to be Janet, and Mark continued to correspond with her despite his mother's warning. John decided that it was time to amp up his story. Now it was revealed that Janet needed Mark's help with the most serious task of all. She asked him,
Could you kill someone close to you? You might be tested on that later on.
I don't know. I probably would, but I would want to know why. I haven't really thought about it.
Well, think, please.
Yeah, I could. There's my answer.
The plot thickened. Janet informed Mark that his friend John had a slowly progressing brain tumor and it was malignant. He would die of this terminal tumor in due time. But Janet explained that the British Secret Service needed John dead as soon as possible. So, why did John need to die? And why did it have to be immediate, given that his alleged brain tumor would kill him anyways? Well, Janet was about to tell Mark everything.
I'm now in a position to tell you why.
Janet explained that this was essentially a mercy killing. Why let John suffer when they could end it all now? Plus, it would put an end to the bodyguard duties and speed up Mark's initiation into the Secret Service. He could also finally collect his earnings from the previous tasks. It wasn't easy to convince Mark to kill someone he considered one of his best friends, but his obsession with Janet overpowered his loyalty to John. Her promise to meet up with him afterwards to have sex was the temptation that he needed to carry out the assassination. However, Mark was still worried about the repercussions he would face if he did as he was told.
Ain't it murder when you kill someone?
Not in your case.
Mark being so gullible made it easy for Janet to convince him that this was the right thing to do. John later said that Mark's trusting nature made piling up the lies addicting and compared it to doing heroin. To ensure that Mark had no inhibitions about carrying out the act, Janet told him what exactly he'd be compensated with. Sexual relations with her, more than £80 million, a career as a high-ranking British Secret Service agent just like her, and a meeting between himself and the Prime Minister Tony Blair to honor Mark. All this would be his if he would just terminate John. To further help convince Mark to go through with it, John sent a message from his real identity. It said,
I got a letter today from my doc when I went in a few weeks ago because I was depressed and shit. I got a brain thingy tumor, but it's big.
John would later explain his reasoning for convincing Mark to kill him by saying that he couldn't keep up the story anymore. He felt like his entire life was a lie and he was trapped in his own fictional world. Admitting to his lies would mean that he would lose Mark as a friend and he would rather die. Although he was suicidal and looking for a way out of his lies, John did give himself a chance to change his mind. Janet's character instructed Mark that 6969 was the abort code, and should he hear this, he needed to stop what he was doing immediately.
6969, abort code, okay? Must stop straight away with 6969.
John never ended up using this code, though. Janet's character also made sure to thoroughly explain to Mark exactly what he needed to do to carry out the assassination. He was to stab John with a large knife.
It has to be big to stab him and make him bleed to death.
Afterwards, she instructed Mark to call an ambulance after waiting a few minutes. At this point, Mark seemed more concerned about meeting Janet, who he'd become infatuated with, and he often asked,
"When will I see you?"
Janet replied that she would meet with him at the police station afterwards while undercover. She further coaxed him to go through with it by telling him that this assassination would get her a promotion within the Secret Service ranks. Finally, Mark was convinced. The chat logs from the night before the murder read as follows.
"He will die in the middle of Alti?"
Please.
But that's what will happen.
I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. Trafford Centre or Manchester?
You want me to take him to Trafford Centre and kill him in the middle of the Trafford Centre? That's what you're asking?
Yes.
And just leave him to die in the Trafford Centre?
No, stay with him.
What do I do then? Get help?
Yes, I'll get help for you. Change of plan. Don't wear glove, pull knife out, and say you took it out.
Okay, but it will only have one set of fingerprints?
He wore gloves.
Okay.
This would mark the end of Mark and Janet's chat room correspondence. By this point, there were more than 58,000 lines of conversation between the different characters, and about 133 gigabytes worth between the two boys' computers. Police analyst Sally Hogg said that if it was represented as paper, it would reach approximately 46,000 feet high. The next day, Mark and John made plans to meet up at the Trafford Centre in Manchester, just as planned. Mark purchased the knife while they were out shopping. Despite knowing exactly what Mark was planning, John asked him what it was for. Mark just replied that he was going to give it to his mother as a gift. At around 7 p.m. that day, they went to an alleyway in the Goose Green area. Reportedly, Mark said, "I love you, bro," to John seconds before he began stabbing him. This too was an order from Janet, who told him to say, "I love you, bro." Make sure he knows you love him. Mark plunged the knife in over and over, telling John to trust him while he continued the assault. John shrieked that he was dying, and he begged for Mark to call an ambulance. Mark shushed him, not wanting anyone to stumble upon them. John screamed that Mark had killed him, which Mark responded to with, "Don't let that be the last thing you're saying." John laid in the alley, blood pouring from his wounds, for about 20 minutes before Mark removed the knife from his stomach and called an ambulance. He told the authorities that some crazy person had attacked John unprovoked. He gave a very generic description of the perpetrator, only saying that he was early 20s, wearing a black hooded jacket and black jeans, and that he quickly fled the scene. John was rushed to the hospital for his severe wounds. He was stabbed all over his torso, piercing his kidney and liver and resulting in his gallbladder being removed. John almost died while being operated on as blood from his injuries were pooling inside his diaphragm. This greatly impeded the function of his lungs, and he was unconscious and needed the aid of a respirator for several days. He was in critical condition, but he was still stable. John spent a week in the hospital recovering from the attack while law enforcement searched for the perpetrator. When he was initially questioned by police, he corroborated Mark's story of an unknown assailant with a knife stabbing him before running off and disappearing. However, it wasn't long before police uncovered evidence that this story was false after they reviewed CCTV footage from that evening. Cameras had caught just Mark and John entering the alleyway, and about 25 minutes later, the only person visible was Mark, who left the alley to call an ambulance. The police confronted John with this, and he eventually admitted that it was Mark who stabbed him. At this point, he felt like all the news coverage made him somewhat of a celebrity, and he wanted to be recognized in public by strangers as the guy who got stabbed. Mark was quickly arrested, charged with attempted murder, and detained in a juvenile detention center. In a police interview, he confessed that he'd done it because he heard voices telling him to kill. He initially didn't say anything about being contracted to carry out the assassination under the order of the British Secret Service, or even mention the name of the agent Janet Dobbinson, who was supposed to be there to ensure that he didn't get into any trouble. It's unclear whether this was because he genuinely thought he would be in danger if he admitted that he was working as an agent, or if he wasn't actually convinced of the scheme and had figured out that it was all fiction. John later said that he was suspicious about how gullible Mark was and how easy it was to convince him of these unbelievable stories. He said that Mark must have known at some point that these characters weren't real. However, Mark's lawyer maintained that he believed every last word the whole way through and truly thought that he would become a Secret Service agent and carry out his life with Janet. Eventually, Mark did break down and tell law enforcement that he committed the attempted murder under direct orders from the British government, and he explained everything that Janet had outlined to him. As I'm sure you can imagine, the police knew that this unbelievable story wasn't true. They initially suspected that Mark made this up in an attempt to put the blame for the attack on someone else. Police confiscated both Mark and John's computers, and they were dumbfounded when they discovered all the chat logs containing months of characters and plot lines, all the way up to the day before the stabbing. As I mentioned before, they had over 58,000 lines of text to analyze. When investigators questioned John again about his involvement in the incident, he confessed to having some knowledge of Janet and a few of the other central characters. He later said that he only admitted this because he was aware that the police had possession of the laptops and they'd be able to deduce it anyways based on his participation in the chat rooms. Police weren't quite sure what to think at this point. Janet Dobbinson was in fact in the chat room, giving months of instructions to Mark and gaining his trust over time. She had manipulated and bribed him into trying to assassinate his friend. Then there were the side characters like Rachel, Lindsay, and Kevin, who all had their own emails and login credentials that they used when corresponding in the chat room. But who would go through so much effort to orchestrate something like this? Police began to theorize that it could be anyone from John's former bullies to a ring of predators lurking in the chat room, which was targeted at teenagers. The investigators admitted that initially they too were fooled by John's virtual worlds, and they believed that all of the characters he created were different and real people. Even though their narratives often made no sense and were completely unbelievable, John had gone to great lengths to ensure that they had unique typing styles and personalities. They also noted that he never slipped up in keeping the personas straight. It became clear to investigators that they needed to find out who exactly Janet Dobbinson was so they could understand why she ordered Mark to kill John. Sally Hogg, one of the police analysts assigned to this case, spent hours poring over the chat logs and looking for a clue that would reveal Janet's true identity. Sally eventually noticed one strange word that appeared over and over. The word was maybe, and it was used by John, Kevin, Dobbinson, and Lindsay. Not a spelling or grammatical error, Hogg decided. A deliberate stylistic variation of maybe shared by 4 supposedly different people. This led investigators to look into where Janet Dobbinson had been. In October 2003, they uncovered the detail that cracked the case. Janet Dobbinson's last login on the day before the murders came from John's computer. Sally immediately told the prosecutor what they'd discovered, who in turn brought that information to the judge. What they thought was a simple case of one teenager being charged for attempted murder had become way more complicated. Shortly afterwards, police brought in John for questioning just before he was getting ready to go to school. Upon police revealing that they knew what he'd done, John confessed to being every single character involved in the story and manipulating Mark into committing the attempted assassination. He said that he created a total of 193 email addresses to keep up with his chat room fiction. During the trial, Mark was shocked when he heard John's confession for the first time. The boy was, no mistaking it, aghast. The beautiful Rachel West, whom he had loved, wooed, and honestly mourned, was John, as was Kevin, who reveled in the bloody details of her gang rape and murder. Lindsay East, who had briefly enchanted him and then disappeared without a word of goodbye, was John. Janet Dobbinson, who had watched him masturbating on a webcam, and who had promised him a lifetime of wealth and glamour, was John. The ice cream vendors and shop assistants engaged in ceaseless surveillance of Mark, all John. The world he had known was John, written, produced, and directed by John. "I've been a fool," said Mark. John explained to the courtroom that he initially created the characters of Rachel, Lindsay, and Kevin to test how trusting Mark was and see how far he could go with their stories. He killed Rachel off when Mark fell in love and begged to meet her, and he admitted that he used her death to grow closer to Mark by keeping up the facade that he was her little brother. John also explained that the tasks he demanded of Mark under the persona of Janet Dobbinson were also orchestrated to further deepen the relationship between the two. In the documentary Kill Me If You Can, John's lawyer said that John was a puppet master and Mark was the puppet dancing to the strings being pulled by John. John was charged with incitement to murder and perverting the course of justice, and Mark with attempted murder. This case was the first time that someone had been formally charged with arranging their own murder. Both boys pled guilty to their charges. John was sentenced with a 3-year supervision order. During this time, he wasn't allowed to access the internet without any supervision. Mark received a sentence of a 2-year supervision order. Both boys were also forbidden to contact each other ever again. A few months after the sentencing, John's mother informed the court that his sessions with a psychologist had led him to undergo a miraculous transformation. He was happier, got along much better with her partner, and he even had a girlfriend now. As I mentioned before, because both boys were minors at the time of the incident, their names have been redacted from the news coverage of the stabbing. So, because there are no reports available that implicate him by his real name, John told his therapist that he lied about the true nature of the crime when telling his girlfriend what happened to him. He told her that someone stabbed him for revenge when he had identified a killer who was on the loose. He also said that his girlfriend didn't believe him. When he was asked about Mark, John grew upset. He missed him and he was sad that he could never contact him again. But he did understand that their friendship was built on lies, and so was the love between them. He said that the friendship with Mark was fake because he had the friendship with Rachel and Janet. Because his real name was never made public, there's no real way to know how he's doing now or if he uses the internet at all anymore. Just looking at the facts of this crime, it's one of the most unbelievable catfishing stories I've ever heard.
Lucky rabbit! Sykes! Like that's the biggest catfish I've ever seen!
Months of keeping up with these identities, spending from dusk till dawn on the computer feverishly crafting plot lines. Then it just became too much for John to handle and caused him to create this elaborate plot to orchestrate his own death. I think that the most shocking part to me is that Mark seems to have truly believed every word, which to me speaks to just how good of a manipulator John was. I'd love to know what you guys think about this case. Do you think Mark really believed the lies and that's why he tried to carry out the assassination? Do you think John was troubled and made up this fictional world to cope, or do you think he was a pathological liar who intentionally manipulated Mark? Please share your thoughts in the comment section. Or if you have a catfishing story of your own, I'd love to hear it. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to my channel. I release new videos every other Saturday. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.